The Confederacy fought the United States with the United States' own guns. This is not a figure of speech. In the first winter of secession, before most of its regiments existed, Southern militias emptied the federal arsenals at Baton Rouge, Augusta, and Fayetteville, tens of thousands of muskets taken without a shot. In April of 1861, the abandoned Navy Yard at Norfolk yielded more than 1,000 cannon in a single night. And for 4 years after, the pattern held. What the South could not forge, it captured. What it could not cast, it captured. What it could not even feed with ammunition, it captured anyway, and fired until the last round ran out. The list that follows counts down 25 of those weapons. Number 12 is a Union cannon that fired on the army that hauled it to the field, a reminder that much of Confederate artillery was captured, not cast. Number 7 is the seizure that handed the South the machinery to build rifles of its own. The countdown begins with the enemy's worst gun. It ends with his best. Number 25, the Gallagher carbine. The Gallagher had a flaw that every man who carried it learned to hate. It was a .50 caliber breech-loading cavalry carbine, patented by Merrill Gallagher in 1860 and manufactured by Richardson and Overman of Philadelphia. And the Union bought more than 22,000 of them. The design had no extractor. A fired case swelled in the breech and stayed there, and a trooper under fire had to dig it out with a knife blade before he could load again. Union cavalrymen petitioned to be rid of the gun. Confederate cavalrymen took it off their bodies and kept it. The captures came the way most carbine captures came in that war. Taken from dead troopers after a mounted skirmish, taken from prisoners, marched to the rear, taken from supply wagons overrun at some crossroads, whose name survives only in regimental histories. In the Western Theater, where Confederate cavalry rode long and supply rode short, a breech loader that could be reloaded on horseback beat any muzzle loader that could not, jammed cases and all. But the carbine came with a condition, and the condition governed everything on this list. The Gallagher fired a special brass and paper cartridge made in northern factories, and the South had no factory that could copy it. A captured Gallagher was worth exactly as many rounds as were captured in the cartridge box beside it. When the box was empty, the gun was iron. The South took it anyway. 24 more weapons will keep making that point. Number 24, the Smith carbine. The Smith broke open at the middle like a shotgun, hinged at the breech, and it was the invention of a physician, Gilbert Smith, a doctor from Buttermilk Falls, New York, who had spent his idle hours on the problem of sealing a breech against escaping gas. His answer was a cartridge case of India rubber, and the Massachusetts Arms Company built more than 30,000 of his carbines for Union cavalry, a .50 caliber weapon that a man could load in a fraction of the time a ramrod demanded. The rubber cartridge was the Smiths' peculiar gift to the men who captured it. Most Union breech loaders starved in Southern hands because their ammunition came from Northern machinery and nowhere else. The Smith's case could be recovered after firing, and a resourceful trooper could improvise replacements from rubber or wrapped foil with powder and ball from his own saddlebag. A gun that could be fed from a saddlebag outlived a gun that could not. In the economy of Confederate supply, that one fact promoted the Smith above weapons that were better in every other respect. So captured Smiths rode with Southern cavalry through the middle years of the war, through 1862 through 1863, through the long horse-killing campaigns in Virginia and Tennessee, while the Confederacy's own carbine works never came close to meeting demand. The doctor's rubber cartridge had been designed to keep gas in the breech. It ended up keeping enemy cavalry in the field. Number 23, the Merrill carbine. James H. Merrill made guns in Baltimore. which in 1861 was a Union city the way a border is a line, technically. His carbine was a .54 caliber breech loader with a long top lever that lifted to open the breech, and the federal government bought some 14,000 of them for its cavalry. Baltimore stayed in the Union. A remarkable number of Baltimore's carbines did not. What made the Merrill worth taking was the very thing that made it old-fashioned. It fired a plain paper cartridge, combustible paper around powder and ball, ignited by an ordinary percussion cap. No brass case drawn on northern machinery, no rubber, no foil, no rimfire copper. Paper cartridges were the one form of ammunition the Confederacy could manufacture in quantity, and Richmond's arsenals turned them out by the million. A captured Spencer went silent when its captured cartridges ran out. A captured Merrill could be fed from Southern hands indefinitely, and Confederate cavalrymen understood the difference precisely. So the Merrill became one of the favored prizes of the mounted war, stripped from Union troopers in the cavalry fights along the Rappahannock and carried south with its future secure. It was not the fastest carbine on the field, nor the newest. It was the one the South could keep alive. In a war of captured weapons, that was a kind of aristocracy. Number 22, the Maynard carbine. Edward Maynard was a dentist in Washington, D.C., a man who spent his professional life on precise mechanical work inside small spaces, and his carbine had the same character. It was a .50 caliber breech loader built by the Massachusetts Arms Company, tipping open at the breech to take a wide-rimmed brass cartridge, and it was light, simple, and accurate, well beyond what its size suggested. In 1860, before any shot had been fired, Georgia, Florida, and Mississippi had already bought Maynards for their state troops. The war would deliver the rest. Captured Maynards reached Southern hands the usual way, and the men who took them discovered the design's quiet advantage. The thick brass case was nearly indestructible. It could be picked up after firing, cleaned, recharged with loose powder and a fresh bullet, capped, and fired again. Not once but many times by hand, by a trooper squatting at a campfire. In a Confederacy that was short of everything, a cartridge case a man could use twice was worth more than the gun that fired it, and the Maynard's cases could be used far more than twice. The whole story of the captured breech loader is compressed into that one piece of brass. The North built weapons on the assumption of infinite supply. The South ran them on the assumption of none. The Maynard was the rare northern gun designed by accident for the southern condition. Number 21, the Burnside carbine. Ambrose Burnside designed his carbine in the 1850s, patented it in 1856, built a factory in Bristol, Rhode Island to make it, and went broke doing it. He sold out his interest, tried railroading, then the Army, where he rose to command the Army of the Potomac. The company that kept his name carried on without him and produced more than 55,000 of his carbines, a .54 caliber breech loader that became the third most numerous cavalry carbine of the entire war. It was captured on a scale no other weapon in this first stretch of the list can match. Not by the handful, not by the company, but by the regiment. At least 7 Confederate cavalry regiments were armed entirely with captured Burnsides, whole commands riding into battle carrying the patented design of a general on the other side. The gun was strong, simple, and well made, and it sealed its breech with a distinctive cone-shaped brass cartridge, tapered like a small bell. That cartridge was also its leash. The tapered case could only be produced on Northern machinery, and the Confederacy never duplicated it. A regiment armed with Burnsides was a regiment mortgaged to its next capture, fighting on ammunition taken from the same enemy who had supplied the guns. And when those rounds gave out, the best carbine in the brigade rode on as dead weight, swinging from a saddle ring. Burnside himself never made a dollar from any of it. His creditors got the patents, the Confederacy got the guns. Number 20. The Henry rifle. Here is the cruelest irony of capture. By the middle years of the war, the most advanced rifle on the continent was a .44 caliber lever-action repeater built in New Haven, Connecticut. 16 rounds in a tube beneath the barrel, fired as fast as a man could swing the lever and pull the trigger. Confederate soldiers learned to dread it. Colonel John Mosby, whose Rangers met the gun in Virginia, called it that damned Yankee rifle that can be loaded on Sunday and fired all week. One firearms historian reckoned a single man with a Henry equal to 14 or 15 men with single-shot muskets. And now and then, in Louisiana, in Texas, in Virginia, Southern hands closed around one. Then the arithmetic reversed. The Henry fed on a .44 rimfire cartridge, a drawn copper case with the priming compound spun into its rim, and that small copper cup sat beyond the industrial reach of the entire Confederacy. It could not draw the copper. It could not compound and seat the priming. It could not build the machines that did either, because the machines were in the North, along with everything else. A captured Henry came with a cartridge box, and nothing behind it. Every shot fired was subtracted from a fixed and shrinking number, so the finest rifle of the war passed through Confederate hands like water. Loud for a week, or a month, or one afternoon. Then quiet. The South could capture the gun. It could never capture the factory. Number 19, the Spencer, repeating rifle. The Spencer was the most advanced shoulder arm issued in quantity to any army on Earth, a .52 caliber repeater that loaded 7 rimfire cartridges through a tube in the butt and fired them as fast as a man could work the lever and thumb the hammer. It was promising enough that President Lincoln test-fired one himself on the lawn behind the White House. The Union bought them by the tens of thousands, and Union cavalry carried them into fights where a single regiment could put out the fire of a brigade. Confederates took Spencers wherever a fight left them lying, and each one arrived carrying the same defect the Henry carried, which was not in the gun at all. The Spencer's cartridge was a copper rimfire case, and the South had no mill and no machinery that could make one. The gun could be taken in an afternoon. The ammunition could only be taken, never made, and captured cartridges ran out with a speed that a 7-shot weapon guaranteed. When the last round was gone, the Spencer became a well-machined, walnut-stocked club. No weapon on this list shows the trap more plainly. 7 shots came fast and went fast. The mills that could replace them ran day and night, and every one of them ran for the other side. Number 18, the Hall rifle and carbine. Not everything the South captured was modern. Some of it was closer to an heirloom. The Hall was the first breech-loading long arm the United States ever adopted, a design out of the 1820s, a gun whose breech tipped up to take powder and ball from the top instead of down the muzzle. By 1861, it was obsolete by every measure. But the federal government had never thrown its halls away. They sat in arsenals across the South by the thousands, oiled, racked, and forgotten. The secession winter found them, when Louisiana militia took the federal arsenal at Baton Rouge in January of 1861. The inventory reported by Confederate ordnance officers included 2,287 Hall rifles in a single haul. They went to some of the earliest Confederate volunteers, men mustered in before their states could offer them anything newer, men who drilled and marched and stood their first picket lines holding a breech loader their fathers might have carried. The Hall marks something the grander weapons on this list can obscure. The arsenal seizures of 1861 did not hand the Confederacy the best of the North's weapons. They handed it everything, the whole accumulated inventory of 40 years of federal storage, antiques included. the South took it all. A 40-year-old rifle was still a rifle. Number 17, the Colt Model 1855 revolving rifle. On paper, the revolving rifle was the obvious idea. Take the mechanism of a revolver, stretch the barrel, add a shoulder stock, and give one man 5 or 6 shots without reloading. Colt built it, and the result looked exactly like what it was: an oversized pistol with ambitions. The trouble was the cylinder. The chambers sat side by side, open at the front, and the flash of one shot could set off its neighbors. Every chamber firing at once, venting flame and lead alongside the barrel, directly ahead of the hand steadying the stock. Soldiers on both sides knew the reputation. The gun could multiply a man's fire, and it could maim the man doing the firing. The reputation stopped nobody. 73 Colt revolving rifles were among the arms seized at the Baton Rouge Arsenal in January of 1861, and more came off the battlefields afterward. And unlike the Henry, unlike the Spencer, this was a repeater the Confederacy could actually feed. It burned loose powder behind a ball and fired on a percussion cap, and powder, ball, and caps were things Southern arsenals could produce. So the captured Colts stayed in service, loaded carefully, fired warily, carried by men who kept their forward hand where the flash could not find it. The Confederacy's hunger can be measured right here. It took whatever repeating firepower it could seize, even a gun its own men were half afraid of. 5 shots were worth the risk. Number 16, the Star Revolver. The Star Arms Company of New York sold the Union more than 47,000 revolvers over the course of the war, and the gun that built that contract was a .44 caliber double action, a revolver that cocked and fired with one long pull of the trigger, no hammer to thumb back first. Most sidearms of the era made a man perform 2 motions for every shot. The Star asked for 1. In most circumstances, the difference was small. In a mounted fight, it was not. When cavalry closed to pistol range, the fight became a matter of seconds and single hands. One fist full of reins, horses shoulder to shoulder, no time and no spare thumb for a hammer. Confederate troopers who pulled, captured stars from Union holsters understood immediately what they were holding. The long trigger pull did the work a second hand could not. And the Star, like the Colt before it, was a percussion gun. It fed on powder, ball, and cap, all of which the South could supply, which meant a captured Star did not fall silent the way the repeaters did. It kept firing for as long as its new owner lived to load it. Captured Stars put a modern Northern handgun on Southern hips years before any Confederate factory could copy anything like it. The division of labor was already fixed, and it held to the end. Invention on one side of the Potomac, salvage on the other. Number 15, the Remington Model, 1858 New Model Army Revolver. The difference between a Remington and a Colt was a single bar of steel. The Colt's frame stood open above the cylinder. The Remington closed the gap with a solid top strap, a bridge of iron running from the breech to the barrel that made the whole gun stiffer, stronger, harder to knock out of true. A trooper could drop it, ride over it, use it as a hammer, and it would still turn and fire. The Union bought them by the tens of thousands as its second revolver of the war, a .44 caliber 6-shot workhorse issued to cavalry regiments across every theater. The Confederacy acquired them by other means. Remingtons came off the Union dead after every major engagement. Prisoners gave them up by the thousand, unbuckled, and handed over at Harper's Ferry and a dozen smaller surrenders. Overrun camps and captured wagons yielded more, still packed in their factory grease. The South had small revolver works of its own, in Georgia and Texas and Virginia, but their combined output over 4 years amounted to a fraction of what a single northern factory shipped in a season. So the sturdy northern revolver went south, one holster at a time. A Confederate officer who carried a captured Remington carried better steel than his own Ordnance Bureau could offer him. Most of them knew it. None of them gave it back. Number 14, the Colt Model 1851 Navy Revolver. Before the war, it was already the most familiar handgun in America. A .36 caliber six-shooter from Samuel Colt's works at Hartford, Connecticut. Light in the hand, quick to the target, balanced the way a good tool is balanced. Naval scenes were roll engraved on the cylinder, which gave the gun its name. The men who carried it were mostly soldiers, lawmen, and horsemen who had never seen salt water. Both armies loved it. That is the unusual thing about the Navy Colt in this story. The South did not merely capture it. The South tried to become it. Confederate machine shops copied the Model 1851 more than any other handgun, turning out imitations with whatever metal could be found, brass frames standing in where iron ran short. The copies worked. They were also, by every account of the men who used them, second best, softer in the frame and rougher in the action than the guns they imitated. A genuine Hartford Colt, lifted from a Union officer's belt, was the standard the imitations were measured against. So the captured originals were prized above the homemade copies, traded for, held on to, carried until the war ended. A Confederate cavalryman with a Union officer's Navy Colt on his hip owned one of the most trusted weapons in either army. The engraving on the cylinder still said what it had always said. Only the owner had changed. Number 13, the Colt Model 1860 Army Revolver. This was the sidearm the Union built the war around. The standard issue handgun of the Federal armies. A .44 caliber six-shot revolver that streamlined the old dragoon horse pistol down to 2 pounds and 11 ounces without surrendering its power. It was the most powerful sidearm of the war and the most numerous, and the government in Washington bought well over 100,000 of them. No weapon was more numerous, and so no weapon was more available to be taken. And taken it was. Stripped from the dead at Shiloh, at Antietam, at Chancellorsville, on every field where the armies closed and the burial details came after. For a Confederate cavalryman, a Model 1860 off a fallen Federal was the finest revolver the continent produced, and thousands changed hands this way over 4 years. Enough to arm Southern raiders, couriers, and staff officers with the North's own best pistol. The gun was issued to protect the men of one army and spent half the war pointed at them. There is no ledger of how many. Nobody counted revolvers the way ordnance officers counted muskets. A pistol slipped from a dead man's holster appeared in no report. It simply rode away. Number 12, the 10-pounder Parrott rifle. Now the guns get heavier. Everything on this list so far could be carried in one hand or slung from a saddle. This one weighed 900 pounds, rolled on wheels taller than a man, and took a 6-horse team to move. And the Confederacy took it anyway, on the first great battlefield of the war. You could recognize a Parrott from half a mile off by its silhouette. A cast-iron tube with a thick band of wrought iron shrunk around the breech, reinforcing the gun at the point of greatest strain. It was a northern solution to a northern problem: how to make a rifled cannon cheap, fast, and by the hundred. And it threw a 10-pound shell with accuracy no smoothbore could approach, at ranges well past a mile. On July 21st, 1861, at First Bull Run, Captain James Ricketts brought a battery of 6 new 10-pounder Parrotts onto Henry Hill in support of the Union attack. The position was too far forward. Confederate infantry overran the guns in hand-to-hand fighting, and the hill changed hands and changed again. And when the fighting ended, the battery belonged to the South. Ricketts himself was captured on the field, wounded 4 times. Within the hour, the guns that had been hauled from a northern foundry to Virginia were firing on the Federal Army as it streamed back toward Washington. They took the guns. They took the limbers. They took the man who commanded them. And it went on that way for 4 years. Much of the Confederacy's field artillery was never cast in a Southern foundry at all. It was captured, hitched to new teams, and turned around. Number 11. The 3-inch ordnance rifle. If the Parrott was the cannon the North built cheaply, this was the cannon the North built well. A slender tube of wrought iron, drawn and welded by a process that produced the most accurate field gun of the war. Its crews claimed they could hit a target the size of a barn door at a mile. And the claim was repeated often enough, by enough gunners on both sides, that it hardened into the gun's reputation. It almost never burst. In a war where cast iron guns sometimes killed their own crews, that was worth as much as the accuracy. The Confederacy could not make one. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of understanding what the gun was, but for lack of the mills. The South had no works capable of forging wrought iron into a gun tube by the Northern method, and no amount of ingenuity in Richmond could conjure the machinery into existence. A Parrott could be imitated roughly. A bronze Napoleon could be cast slowly. The 3-inch ordnance rifle could only be captured, so nearly everyone that served in a Confederate battery had started the war on the other side, taken at Bull Run or Winchester or Harper's Ferry, and folded into the Southern artillery without so much as a change of paint. Of all 25 weapons on this list, it is the purest case. A gun the South could own, but never make. The battlefield did the work its foundries could not. Number 10. The Sharps carbine. The standard shoulder arm of the Union cavalry was a .52 caliber breech loader, short enough to handle on horseback and simple enough to load in the saddle, and the federal government bought more than 80,000 of them before the war was over. It was everywhere the Union cavalry was, which meant, in time, it was everywhere the Confederate cavalry was too. Most of the Sharps carbines in Southern service were battlefield goods, gathered from the grass after mounted fights that ended badly for one side or the other. There was no buying them, and no ordering them for the South. There was only taking them, one skirmish at a time. But the Confederacy did something with the Sharps that it did with almost no other captured weapon. It copied it. S.C. Robinson of Richmond studied the design and built a version by hand, roughly 1,900 carbines, before the Confederate government took the works over and turned out some 3,000 more. The copies were rougher than the Hartford originals, and the troopers who carried both knew the difference. The South paid the Sharps the only compliment its industry could afford. It captured the carbine, and then it captured the idea of the carbine. The good ones still came from the North. Number 9, the Sharps rifle. The same falling block action stretched to a full-length infantry rifle in .52 caliber and issued to the most selective soldiers in the Union Army. Colonel Hiram Berdan's United States sharpshooters, regiments recruited on marksmanship and nothing else. Men who were expected to hit what ordinary infantry could barely see. The rifle was the reason they could work the way they worked. A man with a muzzle loader had to stand, or at least kneel, to drive a ball down the barrel with a ramrod. A man with a Sharps could load it lying flat behind a log, behind a stone wall, behind a dead horse, and never show more of himself than his hat and his hands. Confederates understood exactly what that was worth, because they were on the receiving end of it. A captured Sharps rifle went to the kind of Southern soldier who could use it, the skirmisher, the picked marksman. The man sent forward alone to make officers nervous. In his hands, the advantage changed sides. He fired several aimed shots in the time a Union infantryman managed one, and he did it from the ground, from cover, from places a ramrod could not reach. There is a symmetry in it that the war kept producing. The rifle built for the best shots in the North ended up, a battlefield at a time, in the hands of some of the deadliest men in the South. Nobody planned that. The ground simply gave up what the fighting left on it. Number 8. The Dahlgren Naval Gun. On the night of April 20th, 1861, the United States Navy abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard at Norfolk, Virginia, the greatest naval facility the country owned. The retreating garrison tried to burn it. The fires failed, and what the Union left behind nearly intact was the largest single loss of ordnance it would suffer in the entire war. More than 1,000 cannon, along with 300,000 pounds of gunpowder, waiting in the yard like an inheritance. Among those guns were 52 Dahlgrens, the heavy bottle-shaped naval pieces designed by Union naval officer John Dahlgren and considered the finest naval artillery of the age. The Confederacy had no foundries that could produce anything like them, no naval industry worth the name, and suddenly, in a single night, it had the best heavy guns in America. It did not waste them. The captured pieces were hauled out of Norfolk and shipped across the South, mounted in earthworks and casemates, sighted down rivers and harbor channels. The guns went to Norfolk's own defenses. The guns went to Vicksburg. The guns went as far west as Little Rock. For years afterward, a Union warship steaming up a southern river was, more often than anyone in Washington cared to say, steaming into the muzzles of Union-made guns. The forts that held the Confederate coastline together were armed from one abandoned yard. The Navy that lost them spent the rest of the war fighting them. Number 7. The United States Model 1855 rifle musket. This is the seizure that mattered most. In April of 1861, Virginia forces moved on the United States Armory at Harper's Ferry, one of only 2 national armories in the country. The garrison, badly outnumbered, set fire to the buildings and withdrew. And here the war turned on something as small as a bucket line. Townspeople and militia beat back the flames, and when the smoke cleared, the Confederacy held not only the finished weapons, modern .58 caliber Model 1855 rifle muskets, fitted with the Maynard tape primer, the immediate ancestor of the rifle the Union would carry for 4 years, but the machinery that made them. Picture the weeks that followed, roughly 300 machines coming down off their mountings, crated alongside tens of thousands of tools and unfinished rifle stocks, loaded onto wagons and rail cars and sent south under the direction of a colonel named Thomas Jackson, not yet called Stonewall. The rifle musket tooling went to Richmond. The rifle machinery went to Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2 armories built from one stolen factory. Every other item on this list is a gun the South took. This one is the gun and the means of making guns in one seizure. The Richmond and Fayetteville rifles that armed the Army of Northern Virginia through its greatest campaigns all trace back to those machines. And the machines trace back to one April night when the fires went out too soon. The South could not build the tools, so it carried them off whole. Number 6. The United States Model 1816 musket. Not every captured gun was worth wanting. This one was a .69 caliber flintlock, a design from the era of James Monroe, ignited by a spark from a piece of stone. A musket that had been obsolete for a generation and that the United States Army had long since replaced. But the federal government rarely threw a weapon away. It stored them. Tens of thousands of them, racked and greased in arsenals across the South. And in the winter of 1861, the seceding states simply walked in and took the buildings. At Baton Rouge alone, the shelves gave up more than 8,000 flintlocks. Those antiques went straight into the hands of the earliest Confederate volunteers, because the men were mustering faster than modern weapons could be found, and a flintlock beat an empty hand. Southern gunsmiths did what they could. Thousands of the old muskets were converted from flintlock to percussion, the stone and steel lock cut away, and replaced with a cap system a half-century newer than the barrel it served. No entry on this list is plainer. The Model 1816 was heavy, short-ranged, and old before its soldiers were born, and the Confederacy issued it anyway to regiments that would carry it until a better gun could be taken from somebody else. The first Southern armies were armed out of the enemy's attic. The attic was full. Number 5. The United States Model 1842 musket. This is where the war was armed. Not on a battlefield, not in a factory, but in the storerooms of the federal government itself, in the winter before the shooting started. The Model 1842 was a .69 caliber smoothbore, the last smoothbore musket the United States ever made, and roughly 275,000 of them had been built in the decades before the war. Thousands sat racked in federal arsenals across the South. Oiled, crated, waiting, guarded in most places by a caretaker and a clerk. On the night of January 10, 1861, Louisiana militia surrounded the federal arsenal at Baton Rouge and took it without firing a shot. Louisiana had not yet voted to secede. The haul, tallied afterward by the Confederate Ordnance Bureau, ran to tens of thousands of arms, so many that the governor shipped thousands of the muskets onto Mississippi, arming a second state out of one stolen storehouse. Augusta fell 2 weeks later. Fayetteville followed in April. Arsenal by arsenal, the South emptied shelves the United States had spent 40 years filling. The Model 1842 was outranged and out of date. It was also there, which mattered more. These were the muskets the first Confederate regiments carried at 1st Manassas in July of 1861, months before any Southern factory had produced a serviceable weapon of its own. The 1st Confederate Army marched under new colors carrying old Federal guns. The grease on the barrels was Federal, too. Number 4, the United States Model 1841 Mississippi rifle. In those same arsenal storerooms, stacked beside the smoothbores, was something better. The Model 1841 was a true rifle, .54 caliber, with a grooved barrel that could put a ball into a man at ranges the old muskets could not reach. Soldiers on both sides considered it one of the handsomest weapons the government had ever issued. Brass patchbox, brass bands, a heavy walnut stock built to last. The men who pried open the crates in 1861 knew exactly what they were holding. They also knew its history. In the Mexican War, a regiment of Mississippi volunteers had carried this rifle at Buena Vista in February of 1847, and the colonel of that regiment was Jefferson Davis. The gun had carried his state's name ever since. 14 years later, Davis was president of the Confederacy, and the rifle tied to his one battlefield reputation was being lifted out of federal storage by the thousands to arm the rebellion he now led. The seceding states did not have to imagine what the Mississippi rifle could do. Their president had already shown them. Baton Rouge alone yielded thousands of rifles alongside its muskets, and the Mississippis among them went to the regiments that wanted them most. Through the first 2 years of the war, a Confederate volunteer with a Mississippi rifle was better armed than most of the men around him. He owed that advantage to the United States Army. The Army had bought the rifle, stored the rifle, and lost the rifle. All the Confederacy did was open the door. Number 3, the 12-pounder Napoleon. The Napoleon was the workhorse gun of the war, a bronze smoothbore that threw a 12-pound ball a mile, and at close range, threw canister, a tin can of iron balls that turned the gun into a shotgun the size of a horse. Both armies built their artillery around it. Both armies trusted it. Only one of them could make it in quantity. The South's problem was bronze, and foundries, and time. The North cast more than 1,100 Napoleons in 4 years. The Confederacy managed roughly 600, most of them from the Tredegar Works in Richmond, the one heavy foundry the South possessed, and Tredegar was also expected to produce armor plate, shot, shell, and machinery for an entire nation. The arithmetic never closed. Every Confederate battery commander knew where the shortfall would be made up. On the field, from the enemy, one overrun gun line at a time. And it was. Captured Napoleons were dragged off battlefields from Virginia to Tennessee, relimbered, repainted, and rolled into Confederate batteries beside the Tredegar pieces. A British officer traveling with Lee's army in 1863 noted how many of its guns were Northern-made, and Confederate gunners came to prefer the captured pieces. The Northern castings were cleaner, the metal more reliable. The South fired Northern bronze at Northern infantry for 4 years. The gun did not care who owned it. Number 2, the rifles of Harper's Ferry. September 1862. On September 15, 1862, the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry surrendered to Stonewall Jackson. More than 12,000 United States soldiers laid down their arms that morning, the largest surrender of American troops until the Second World War, 80 years later. The men were paroled and marched away. The story that matters is what they left on the ground. Roughly 12,000 stand of arms, most of them modern rifle-muskets, stacked and waiting. Rifles by the rack, rifles by the wagon load, rifles enough to re-equip whole brigades, handed over in a single morning, with no factory and no purchase order anywhere behind them. For the Confederate ordnance officers who inventoried the haul, it was more first-class weaponry than the South's own armories could produce in months. The timing is the point. Lee's army was in Maryland, ragged, barefoot in places, and badly armed, with thousands of men still carrying smoothbores and converted flintlocks from the arsenal seizures of 1861. 2 days after the surrender, that army stood in line along Antietam Creek and fought the bloodiest single day in American history. Some of the men in that line fought it with rifles that had belonged to the United States Army on Monday. The wagons had barely stopped moving. Jackson's men marched out of Harper's Ferry better armed than they had ever been, on weapons the North had manufactured, issued, and lost in bulk. The Confederacy's best quartermaster that September was the United States government. It kept Lee's army in the field for the fight of its life. Number 1, the captured Springfield Model 1861 rifle musket. At the top of this list is the rifle the North built to win the war. The Springfield Model 1861 was the standard arm of the Union infantry, a .58 caliber rifle musket, accurate to several hundred yards, produced by the Springfield Armory, and a network of private contractors in numbers no country on earth could match. Around 1 million would be made. It was the finest widely issued infantry weapon in America, and it became, by every serious accounting, the single most important rifle in the Confederate Army. The South took them everywhere the armies met. At First Bull Run, where the route left the roads to Washington littered with them, at Second Manassas, at Harper's Ferry, at Chancellorsville, where the harvest after the victory ran to tens of thousands. After every battle the Confederacy won, and many it lost, details moved across the field collecting arms, from the wagons, from the prisoners, from the dead. The rifles went back to depots in Richmond and elsewhere to be cleaned, repaired, and reissued. And the scale of that system is the fact this entire list has been building toward. By the war's end, an estimated 200,000 captured Springfields had passed through Confederate hands. 200,000. The Richmond Armory, the largest the South ever ran, could not approach that figure. No Southern factory could. Add them all together, and they still could not. The single largest source of rifles for the Confederate infantry was the United States Army. Its losses, its surrenders, its dead. A Confederate soldier in the war's middle years was more likely to carry a Springfield than anything his own government had made, and he carried it against the army it was built for. The North's answer to the rebellion was industry. The rebellion's answer was to pick industry's product up off the ground. It worked for 4 years. It could never work for 5. The Confederacy fought the United States with the United States' own guns. It began in the Secession winter, in the arsenals at Baton Rouge and Augusta and Fayetteville, where the South armed its first 100,000 men out of federal storerooms. It continued at Bull Run, at Harper's Ferry, at Chancellorsville, wherever a battlefield could be gleaned before the burial parties finished. It could not outproduce the North, not in muskets, not in cannon, not in the copper for a single rimfire cartridge. So it outscavenged it, season by season, field by field, until the victories stopped and the fields stopped yielding and there was nothing left to take. At Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia marched between two lines of Union infantry and stacked its arms in the road. Thousands of the rifles in those stacks were Springfields, going back to the government that made them. They stood there through the afternoon in the Virginia light. Muzzles leaned together, lock plates stamped with a small Federal eagle and a single word: Springfield. The rain came later and beaded on the barrels. The iron did not know it had ever been gone.